May 2nd, 1957, 10:50 p.m. The air inside the yellow cab was thick with cigar smoke and the scent of expensive cologne. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, sat alone in the back, the city lights of Manhattan streaking past the window. He had just left a dinner at L'Aiglon on East 55th Street. The cab pulled to a smooth stop in front of 115 Central Park West, the majestic apartments. A grand, twin-towered Art Deco fortress that was his home, his castle. He paid the driver, stepped onto the curb, and adjusted the knot of his silk tie. He was 66 years old, but he moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who owned the very pavement he walked on. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the building's canopy. A man, large and imposing, 6'2", maybe 240 pounds. He wore a dark suit and a fedora pulled low. The figure took 2 quick steps forward. "This is for you, Frank," he yelled. Costello turned his head, a flicker of something, annoyance, not surprise, crossing his face. The sound was a flat, ugly pop that was swallowed by the city's hum. A flash of orange. Costello felt a searing heat race across the right side of his skull. He stumbled, his hand flying to his head, coming away, wet and dark. The big man, Vincent Gigante, turned and ran, melting back into the night, certain his job was done. Certain the king was dead. What nobody knew, what the history books and the screaming headlines of the next day's papers would never tell you, is that the story didn't end there. It began. Because Vito Genovese, the man who ordered the shot, had just made the single greatest miscalculation of his life. He had tried to kill a man with a bullet, when that man's true power was never in his muscle. It was in his mind. To understand the shot that echoed across Central Park West, you have to rewind. You have to go back to a New York City that no longer exists. This was the 1950s, the absolute zenith of La Cosa Nostra's power in America. They weren't just gangs. They were a parallel government, a shadow corporation, with its hands in everything from the docks to the district attorney's office. And for nearly 20 years, the chairman of that board, the man who kept the peace and made sure the money flowed, was Francesco Castiglia, better known as Frank Costello. Costello was a different breed. He wasn't a back-alley brawler who rose through bloodshed. He was a Calabrian, not a Sicilian, which already set him apart. He was a thinker, a strategist, a diplomat. While others were breaking heads, Costello was shaking hands. He understood that true, lasting power wasn't in the barrel of a gun. It was in a politician's pocket, in a judge's favor, in a union boss's loyalty. He earned the nickname, the Prime Minister, because he governed. He mediated disputes between the 5 families with the skill of a seasoned statesman, preventing the bloody wars that cost everyone money. His personal empire was built on gambling. Not the dirty street corner stuff, but a vast, nationwide network of slot machines and bookmaking operations that generated millions. In the 1940s, he had an estimated 25,000 slot machines operating in Louisiana alone, thanks to his deep connections with Governor Huey Long's political machine. He ran his organization like a legitimate business, with accountants and lawyers and lobbyists. He wore custom-tailored suits, frequented the finest restaurants, and counted powerful public figures among his friends. He wanted legitimacy. He saw himself as a businessman whose product just happened to be illegal. This was his code of honor. A paradoxical one, to be sure, but a code nonetheless. He believed in order. He believed that the underworld could and should operate with a set of rules that minimized civilian harm and maximized profit for all. He was, in his own way, a community protector. He kept the more violent elements in check, ensuring that the streets of his territory were safe for the ordinary people who lived and worked there. A stable environment was good for business, and Frank Costello was all about business. He ruled through respect, and the fear he inspired was not the fear of random violence, but the fear of his intellect. The fear of being outmaneuvered by a man who was always 3 moves ahead. But while Costello was building bridges to the legitimate world, a different kind of power was festering in the shadows. His name was Vito Genovese. If Costello was the prime minister, Vito Don Vitone Genovese was the warlord. They had come up together under the same mentor, the legendary Charles Lucky Luciano. But they were night and day. Where Costello was smooth, Genovese was coarse. Where Costello used finesse, Genovese used force. He was a throwback to the old Sicilian mustache Pete's, a man who believed power grew directly from a well-placed knife and a reputation for brutality. He was ambitious, ruthless, and pathologically greedy. In 1937, Genovese fled to Italy to escape a murder indictment. He spent the war there, ironically working with the American military government after Mussolini's fall, all while running a massive black market operation. He lived in a lavish villa outside Nola, near Naples. He was a king in his own right, but it wasn't enough. He wanted New York. He wanted what Costello had. In 1945, he was arrested and shipped back to the United States to face that old murder charge. The key witness against him, a man named Peter Latempa, was found in his jail cell, poisoned. With no witness, the case collapsed. Vito Genovese walked free on June 10, 1946, a smirk on his face and murder in his heart. He returned to the Luciano family, now effectively the Costello family, and had to swallow the bitter pill of being the underboss to a man he considered his inferior. He watched Costello hold court at the Copacabana, read about him in Walter Winchell's columns, and seethed. He saw a man who'd gone soft, a man who talked more than he fought, a man who was more concerned with his golf handicap than with consolidating street power. This was the simmering conflict at the heart of the most powerful crime family in America. The smooth corporate philosophy of Frank Costello versus the brutal, old-world ambition of Vito Genovese. For a decade, an uneasy truce held, maintained by Costello's deep network of support among the other bosses who appreciated the peace and prosperity he provided. But by 1957, the ground was shifting. The Kefauver Committee hearings in 1951 had put a national spotlight on Costello. His televised hands, twitching nervously as he refused to show his face, became an iconic image of mob secrecy. The federal government was breathing down his neck. He was in and out of court, fighting deportation and tax evasion charges. He was distracted. He was vulnerable. And Vito Genovese, the patient predator, knew it was time to strike. The decision was made in the back room of a social club in Greenwich Village, a place that smelled of stale cigar smoke and dried blood. The year was 1957. Vito Genovese had spent a decade rebuilding his power base within the family, promoting loyalists and quietly undermining Costello's authority. He had waited for the perfect moment of weakness, and now, with Costello bogged down in legal battles, That moment had arrived. Genovese gathered his inner circle. These were not men who appreciated Costello's diplomatic touch. They were soldiers, killers, and thugs who respected one thing: brute strength. They saw Genovese as a true boss, a man of action, while Costello was just a politician who had forgotten his roots. "He's not one of us anymore," Genovese growled, his voice a low rumble. "He talks to senators. He plays golf. He thinks he's better than us." He spat on the floor. "The family is weak. The other families laugh at us. They see a banker, not a boss." This was Genovese's narrative, the story he sold to his crew. He framed Costello's success, his connections, his entire philosophy of power as a form of corruption, a betrayal of their gangster ethos. He was tapping into a deep-seated resentment among the street-level soldiers who felt left behind by Costello's corporate ambitions. The specific action was simple and direct. It was the Genovese way. No complex scheming, no intricate plot, just a single, decisive act of violence. He would have Frank Costello killed. He believed that with Costello gone, the family would fall into his lap. The capos and soldiers, he reasoned, would have no choice but to rally behind the strongest man standing. He chose his weapon carefully. He needed someone loyal, someone hungry, and someone utterly disposable if things went wrong. He found him in a 28-year-old rising star from his Greenwich Village crew, a former professional boxer who was built like a bull and was famously erratic. His name was Vincent Gigante, but the streets were already starting to call him the Chin. Gigante was fiercely loyal to Genovese, who had been his mentor. He was also ambitious and saw this as his chance to make his name, to earn his stripes in the most dramatic way possible. The approach was brutally straightforward. Gigante would be the triggerman. He was given a .38 caliber revolver and a simple set of instructions. Follow Costello from one of his regular dinner spots and shoot him as he entered his apartment building. No witnesses if possible. Get it done and disappear. And here lay the fatal miscalculation. It was a plan born of pure arrogance, a fundamental underestimation of the man he was trying to eliminate. Genovese saw Costello as a creature of habit, a predictable old man whose routines made him an easy target. He saw a politician, not a survivor. He believed that the same rules of violence that governed the streets would apply to the prime minister. He thought a single bullet could erase 20 years of influence, loyalty, and intricate power. Genovese was a checkers player in a world run by a chess grandmaster. He saw the king as just another piece to be taken off the board. He failed to understand that Costello's real power wasn't his position on the board. It was his understanding of the entire game. He couldn't conceive that Costello might have a defense prepared for a threat he hadn't even fully identified yet. Genovese's plan was linear, predictable, and based on the flawed premise that Frank Costello would simply let it happen. It was the kind of mistake that gets kings killed, but it's also the kind of mistake that turns legends into myths. The story history forgot is that Frank Costello was never truly caught by surprise. Not completely. To believe he was is to fall for the same mistake Genovese made. It's to underestimate the man. Costello operated on a simple principle. Information was more valuable than gold, more powerful than 1,000 guns. His reign as prime minister was built on a sprawling, invisible network of eyes and ears. He had doormen, waiters, bartenders, shoeshine boys, city clerks, and even cops on his payroll. Not as heavies or enforcers, but as listening posts. They were the low-level, overlooked people who saw and heard everything. They were his early warning system. In the weeks leading up to May 2nd, 1957, the system began to hum. It wasn't a loud alarm, but a series of quiet, disconnected whispers. A bartender at a place frequented by Genovese's crew overheard talk of a change at the top. A parking attendant in the village noticed unfamiliar cars idling near Genovese's social club at odd hours. A clerk in a courthouse who owed Costello a favor mentioned that Genovese's known associates were suddenly being very careful, very quiet, as if holding their breath before a storm. None of these were a smoking gun. They were just fragments, pieces of a puzzle with no clear picture. But for a mind like Costello's, fragments were enough. He took these disparate bits of intelligence and laid them out in his mind. He knew Genovese's ambition was a loaded gun that had been pointed at his head for a decade. He knew his own legal troubles were the perfect catalyst. The whispers confirmed his suspicions. Genovese was no longer just waiting. He was planning. This created a profound dilemma for Costello. What do you do when you know a blow is coming, but you don't know how or when? The obvious brutish solution, the Genovese solution, would be a preemptive strike. To send his own men to eliminate Vito before Vito could eliminate him. But that was never Costello's way. It was messy. It was crude. It would ignite a war that would tear the five families apart, destroy the peaceful, profitable empire he had spent his life building, and bring the full weight of the law down on all of them. It was a losing move, even if he won. So he rejected it. He chose a more elegant, more strategic path. His plan wasn't to prevent the attack. It was to survive it, and then to use the attack itself as the ultimate weapon against his rival. He began to make subtle, almost imperceptible changes to his routine. He would tell his driver to take a different route home at the last minute. He would linger for an extra 5 minutes at his table or leave 10 minutes earlier than planned. He started carrying his own key to the lobby of the Majestic rather than waiting for the doorman to let him in. These were tiny shifts, designed to disrupt the timing of any potential ambush without signaling that he was aware of a specific threat. But the core of his plan was psychological and forward-thinking. He gamed out the aftermath in his head. He knew that a failed assassination attempt on a boss was a catastrophic breach of Mafia protocol. A boss could only be removed by a vote of the Commission, the ruling body of the National Syndicate. To act unilaterally, as Genovese was planning, was a declaration of war against the entire structure. Costello's brilliant secret plan was this: let Genovese make his move. Let him break the rules. If Costello died, it was game over. But if he lived, and he was subtly stacking the deck in favor of that outcome, Genovese would be exposed. He would be seen as a reckless, honorless usurper who had violated their most sacred laws. The attack itself would become the evidence that would condemn him in the court of underworld opinion. Costello was preparing to sacrifice the throne to save his life and, in the long run, win the war. He was turning his enemy's greatest strength, his willingness to use violence, into his fatal weakness. It was a breathtakingly audacious strategy. He was going to let Vito Genovese shoot him, just to prove a point. If this story has you hyped and you're starting to see how this chess game was played, do me a favor and hit that like button real quick. It helps the channel more than you know. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? You don't want to miss the end of this. Now, let's go back to that sidewalk. The night of May 2nd, 1957, was cool and clear. The taxi carrying Frank Costello turned off Central Park South and headed north along the western edge of the park. The majestic apartments loomed ahead, its twin towers lit against the dark sky. Inside the cab, Costello was calm. He had received a final, crucial piece of information just hours earlier. His invisible informant was a waiter at L'Aiglon, a young man whose family Costello had helped years ago. The waiter had noticed a man dining alone, a man he recognized as one of Genovese's button men. The man wasn't eating. He was watching. Specifically, he was watching Costello. When Costello's party began to break up, the man quickly paid his check and left, making a brief call from a payphone in the lobby. The waiter, sensing something was wrong, slipped a note to Costello's driver. The note had 3 words: "Man watching, left." It was the final piece of the puzzle. Costello now knew the attack was not just probable, it was imminent. It was happening tonight. As the cab pulled up to 115 Central Park West, Costello's mind was a blur of calculations. He got out of the cab. He saw the doorman, who usually rushed to open the lobby door, was busy helping another tenant with their luggage. A small, random detail, but one that changed the geometry of the moment. He would have to walk those last 10 feet alone. He saw the shadow detach from the wall. He saw the hulking frame of Vincent Gigante, a man he recognized instantly. He heard the shout, "This is for you, Frank." This was the trigger event. The moment Genovese's crude plan came to fruition. But Costello was ready. His plan, formulated over weeks of quiet intelligence and strategic foresight, was now in motion. In the split second between the shout and the gunshot, he did not duck or dive for cover. That would be the reaction of a man taken by surprise. Instead, he executed a precise, practiced movement. He turned his head sharply to the left, as if reacting to the sound of the voice. It was a movement of inches, but it was the most important movement of his life. The .38 caliber slug, aimed at the center of the back of his head, was now on a new trajectory. Instead of penetrating his skull and brain, it tore a bloody furrow across the right side of his scalp, from back to front, grazing the bone but missing anything vital. The forensic reality was that a half-inch difference saved his life. The strategic reality was that Costello's intellect had moved his head that half-inch. The reveal wasn't a counter-ambush. It wasn't a team of Costello's gunmen appearing from the shadows to mow Gigante down. The reveal was quieter, colder, and far more devastating. Gigante, seeing Costello stumble and seeing the blood, assumed his mission was a success. He did what he was told. He fled. He ran to a waiting car and disappeared into the city, convinced he had just made his name by killing a legend. But the legend was still standing. Costello straightened up, his hat gone, blood running down his face and onto the collar of his expensive shirt. He didn't shout. He didn't collapse. He calmly walked into the lobby of the Majestic. The doorman, having finished with the luggage, turned and saw him. The doorman's face went white with shock. "Mr. Costello, you're bleeding," he stammered. Costello looked at him, his eyes clear and cold. He was no longer just a victim. He was the architect of the next phase. "It's nothing," he said, his voice steady. "Just a scratch." He then walked to the elevator, rode it up to his penthouse apartment, and the first call he made was not to a doctor, but to his lawyer. The game was afoot. The aftermath began not with a bang, but with a quiet display of defiance that would become legendary. The doorman, a man named Aloysius Neil Pucci, was the first to act. He called the police. Within minutes, the lobby of the Majestic was swarming with patrolmen and detectives. They found Costello in his apartment, his wife, Loretta, tending to the bloody gash on his head with a wet cloth. The detectives, eager to solve the shooting of one of the city's most powerful figures, began their questioning. "Who shot you, Frank?" they asked. "Who did this?" Costello looked up from his chair, his gaze unwavering. This was the first move in his endgame. He knew that naming Vito Genovese would be seen as an act of a snitch, a violation of the sacred code of omerta. More importantly, it would force the police to act, sparking the very gang war he had worked so hard to avoid. A war, in his weakened state, he might not win. So he delivered the lesson. He gave them the line that would be printed in every newspaper the next day. "I don't know," he said calmly. "I didn't see anyone." The cops were incredulous, but he stuck to his story. He described the flash, the noise, but claimed he never got a look at the shooter. It was a masterful move. To the outside world, he was upholding the code. To the underworld, he was sending a clear message. This is our business, not theirs. I will handle this my way. The police, however, were not entirely without a victory. While searching his coat for identification, they found a slip of paper in his pocket. On it was a handwritten ledger of figures totaling $73,436.84. It was a record of his winnings from a casino partnership in Las Vegas. That piece of paper, an ironic consequence of the assassination attempt, would lead to a federal indictment and eventually a prison sentence for tax evasion. Genovese's bullet had inadvertently given the government the weapon they needed to temporarily cage their old foe. Meanwhile, word of the event spread through the underworld like wildfire. The initial reports claimed Costello was dead. Genovese began to accept congratulations. But then came the shocking correction. He was alive. He had a scratch. A scratch. The reaction was seismic. The other bosses of the 5 families were both terrified and appalled. Genovese had broken the cardinal rule. He had tried to kill a sitting boss without the sanction of the commission. It was a move toward dictatorship, a threat to all of them. Emergency meetings were held in quiet restaurants and back rooms across the city. The primary topic was not celebrating Genovese's rise, but a shared sense of dread. They acknowledged his new power, but it was a power born of fear, not respect. They now saw him as a rabid dog off his leash. Genovese himself was furious and shaken. His simple plan had failed in the most humiliating way possible. Costello was not only alive, but he was now a martyr, a living symbol of Genovese's treachery. He quickly called a meeting of the family's capos. Costello, ever the grandmaster, knew his next move. He knew Genovese would try again. He knew his position as head of the family was now untenable. It would require constant bloodshed to maintain. And Frank Costello was tired of fighting. He was 66 years old. He had all the money he could ever spend. He wanted to live, so he made the ultimate strategic retreat. He sent a message to the meeting. He would not contest Genovese's claim. He was stepping down. He would cede control of the family and all its rackets. He would retire. To the outside, it looked like a surrender, a defeat. Genovese had won. He was now the boss of the most powerful crime family in America. But the men in the room, the men who understood the real game, knew differently. Costello hadn't been defeated. He had chosen his own exit. He had traded a title for his life, and in doing so, had denied Genovese the satisfaction of a true victory. He walked away, not as a vanquished foe, but as an elder statesman entering a new phase. He had lost the battle for the family, but he was about to win the war. The long-term impact of the night of May 2nd, 1957, reshaped the American Mafia for decades. Vito Genovese got exactly what he wanted, and it destroyed him. He became the official boss of the Luciano crime family, which was immediately renamed the Genovese family in his honor. But his crown was heavy, and his throne was unstable. His victory was tainted by the bungled assassination and the violation of commission rules. He was feared, but he was not respected. He had the loyalty of his crew, but the other bosses viewed him with deep suspicion. To solidify his power and put an official stamp on his new title, Genovese called for a grand meeting of bosses from all over the country. It was to be his coronation. The meeting was set for November 14th, 1957, in the sleepy upstate New York town of Appalachian, at the secluded estate of a mobster named Joseph Barbara. What history often forgets is the quiet hand that may have guided what happened next. Frank Costello, now in retirement, was not idle. He was still the prime minister, just without a portfolio. He and his longtime associate, the financial genius Meyer Lansky, were watching. They had been publicly humiliated by Genovese, and they were not men who forgot. The Appalachian meeting was a catastrophe. An alert state trooper, Sergeant Edgar Croswell, noticed an unusual number of expensive, out-of-state cars descending on the tiny town. His suspicions aroused. He called for backup and set up roadblocks. The raid sent nearly 60 of the country's most powerful mobsters fleeing through the woods in their expensive suits, only to be rounded up by the police. The summit was exposed to the world, blowing the lid off the secrecy of the National Crime Syndicate and bringing unprecedented heat from law enforcement. SIT was a disaster from which the Mafia never fully recovered. And while it was never proven, the quiet rumor in the underworld was always that the tip-off to Sergeant Croswell came from a source connected to Costello and Lansky. It was the perfect checkmate. Costello, the man Genovese tried to kill with a gun, had retaliated with a whisper. He used his old weapons, information and connections, to orchestrate his rival's downfall from the sidelines. He had turned Genovese's moment of triumph into his ultimate humiliation. The fallout from Appalachian finished Genovese. He was now a marked man, not just by the government, but by his own peers who blamed him for the fiasco. In 1959, he was indicted on federal narcotics charges. The star witness against him was a small-time drug dealer. The word on the street was that Costello and Lansky paid the dealer $100,000 to lie on the stand. True or not, it worked. Vito Genovese was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He died behind bars in 1969. Frank Costello, on the other hand, lived out his days in quiet splendor. After a short stint in prison on the tax evasion charge, he returned to his penthouse at the Majestic. He was no longer a boss, but he was something more. He was an institution, a living legend. Younger mobsters would come to him for advice, treating him like a revered elder statesman. He would sit in his garden, tending his flowers, the man who had outmaneuvered them all. He died of a heart attack in 1973, at the age of 82, in his own bed. The ultimate moral of the story, the lesson that echoed from that single gunshot, was profound. The most dangerous weapon in the world isn't a .38 caliber revolver. It's the mind that knows what's coming before the trigger is ever pulled. It's the foresight to understand that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in fighting, but in letting your enemy destroy himself. Costello's retirement wasn't an act of cowardice. It was the ultimate power move. He taught the underworld a lesson they would never forget. Brute force can win a battle, but only strategy can win the war. So, what do you think? Was Costello's decision to step down an act of surrender, or was it the most brilliant checkmate in mob history? Let me know your take in the comments below. The story of the American underworld is full of brutal men, but the ones who truly lasted were the ones who thought differently. And if you think the power struggle between Costello and Genovese was wild, just wait. Next week, we're going to a different part of New York to tell the story of a woman who stood up to the most feared gangster of his time and won. We're telling the story of Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of policy in Harlem, and her war with Dutch Schultz. You absolutely do not want to miss it, so make sure you're subscribed with that notification bell turned on. In New York City, power wasn't taken. It was earned.